Humility, the queen of the virtues. Humility is not a leadership trait that today's leaders seem to desire. Really, who signs up for or desires to be of low regard or to be meek? Somehow, the concepts of leadership and humility seem to be disconnected in the minds of leaders and aspiring leaders. And perhaps this lack of desire for leaders to embrace humility is rooted in the misconception of the virtue itself, or perhaps in the lack of knowledge of the benefit to leadership and followers. In fact, a perusal of the literature offers very little interest in the connection between leadership and humility. And yet history and time has shown us that great leaders are often noted as humble. This presentation seeks to show the true meaning of the virtue of humility, considered the queen virtue or the mother virtue, as well as to present a discussion on humility and leadership, including what it is, what it looks like, how it is manifested, and finally, the benefits of humility and leadership. So humility, what is it? In the past several years, there has been a resurgence of interest in humility within leadership. Interestingly, when you consider the idea that humility was at one point considered the lost virtue or the orphan virtue, a perusal of the leadership academic literature offers little in this understanding of humility. That is, until the last decade, and mostly this is attributable to the work of Jim Collins. In Collins' highly touted book, Good to Great, Why Some Companies Make the Leap and Others Don't, a convincing case is made for humility in leadership as being a distinction between moving good leaders into becoming great leaders. The words humble and humility actually come from the Latin word humus, which means earth or ground. In essence, to be humble is to be grounded. And when one thinks about it, if one's feet are firmly on the ground, then one has both balance and resilience. Knowing humility keeps one grounded, and one might begin to ask if humility in leadership is even needed, or maybe if leaders can even effectively lead without it. Thus, one might wonder why humility is considered lost, a characteristic of an older time, or an orphan virtue in this age, or even sometimes a quaint notion of the past. Perhaps the understanding of humility lies in the very understanding of what it actually is. Humility is the opposite of pride and the desire for power and esteem. John Stott is noted as saying that pride is our greatest enemy and humility is our greatest friend. C.S. Lewis put it perfectly when he called pride the spiritual cancer. Pride is something that destroys us personally and in our leadership. Unfortunately, many men fall prey to pride. Yet, fortunately, the antidote is humility. Indeed, there is no vice is found, but is the shadow of some virtue. Of great interest is that pride is the father of all the vices, and humility is the mother of the virtues. And most scholars tend to agree that pride is present in all of the vices, and humility present working symphonically with all of the other virtues. Kreeft puts the relationship between pride and humility quite nicely. He says that the greatest virtue keeps us from the greatest vice. Quite simply, pride is self-focused, while humility is others-focused. To understand humility, we must realize that it is a paradoxical concept, often seen as a weakness for leaders where leaders are meek and permissive, and this misunderstanding of what humility actually is hinges upon a true definition and understanding. Now, while we see humility as a weakness, something that would cause a leader to be a weakling, a permissive person, or even a pushover, in actuality, and quite simply, humility is a strength that causes the leader to have a non-overestimation of their own merits. Humility in leadership is the leader realizing that they are not the end-all to what is happening, the ability to keep our talents and accomplishments in perspective, and quite simply knowing that one does not have all the answers. Indeed, humility is a virtue. Humility as a virtue. Humility is considered the mother virtue, a critical virtue, and a peaceful virtue. It's also been called the quiet virtue, as well as the queen of all the virtues. Now, Aristotle is credited with establishing the framework for defining virtue, which comes from the Greek word arete, meaning excellence. Aristotelian virtue is defined as consisting of three elements: The virtues are good habits, the middle ground between the extremes of too much and too little, and a habit that is a firm and settled disposition in choosing good. A virtue is part of one's character, internal, spiritual. Virtue theory addresses the idea of doing the right things with a focus on moral character. Really doesn't answer the question of right or wrong, but rather seeks to do the right thing. Virtue theory is considered the oldest normative tradition in Western philosophy, with roots in Greek civilization, most notably Aristotle. Virtue theory declined during Renaissance times, scientific revolutions, and during the Enlightenment. However, a contemporary resurgence has occurred, with an emphasis on the rights of others involved, or rather, an emphasis on other people. Virtues are considered those characteristics that exemplify human excellence. Virtues have a place in leadership through the focus on the good, rather than on profit maximizing, allowing leadership to become more about the dynamic interaction among members. A virtue is a qualitative characteristic that is a part of one's character, something within a person that is internal, almost spiritual. According to Whetstone as well as Patterson, servant leadership is the preferred paradigm for the virtues perspective, and further, servant leaders serve according to highly principled means. The virtue of humility causes one to consider moderation, to listen to the advice of others, and to come with the realization of power as being less than dictatorial. Humility is a peaceful virtue that rejects self-glorification, and it's almost a social reversal in that it purports the idea of serving. Now, the peculiarity of the virtue of humility is that if one is truly humble, then one cannot esteem oneself, or to think highly enough of self to believe it to be so. While humility is often considered this weakness, it most certainly is not. This virtue is not overvaluing of oneself with respect to the worth of all moral persons. When we look at humility in leadership, we see that leaders have the greatest temptation to think of themselves more highly than they ought. In fact, leaders often fall prey to believing their own press and begin to think that they are better than perhaps they truly are. And according to recent perspectives, both scholarly and popular press, there is an indication that leaders are seemingly more and more interested in widespread notoriety, having gained a charismatic-like appeal, often accompanied by a significant increase in their social status, similar to that of a movie star or star athlete. So much so that leaders have been referred to as idols, heroes, saviors, warriors, magicians, omniscient demigods. Some leadership scholars have stated that a common notion in leadership thinking today is the hero and his 1,000 helpers. And this romantic notion of leaders, or the glorification of leaders, has increased despite continuing evidence that many of the actions of leaders are far from heroic. And interestingly, in the leadership literature, humility has had some pretty impressive champions lately. In other words, the literature is beginning to pay attention to the idea that humility and leadership actually work very well together. According to Gunn and Gullikson in 2006, a list of the critical competencies or traits required for successful organizational leadership must include humility. Congruent thinking by DAT includes humility as an imperative in building strong organizations, building strong followers who reach their full potential, and gives a rich organizational life. Next follows a discussion on the key components of leadership and humility, and then how humility is evident in leaders who are noted as servant leaders. And there are several key components of humility in leadership offered by the literature. These include the ability to bear insults, to have manliness, to know thyself, to be content, and to keep one's perspective. Insults. Humility encompasses the ability to bear insults. In other words, insults do not bother the truly humble, as nothing could be said that the leader might not already believe about himself. This would include the ability to admit one's mistakes, not only with forthright admission, but admission with compassion for self and for others. Humility actually causes one to embrace the opportunity to improve oneself for the sake of others. Ever hear of turning the other cheek? Humility is a prerequisite for the ability to let insults or even harsh judgments roll off one's back and to be forgotten if need be. Manliness. Some have seen humility as a sign of manliness. And manliness meaning, according to English theologians and most notably Thomas Kempis, that a manly person is the master of self in such issues as pride, envy, greed, and anger. A true manliness person is considered humble, content, and willing to suffer injuries without revenge. The strength of character where one is not affected by self-destructive tendencies. Humility is completely consistent with a healthy ego. Next is to know thyself. The ability for self-analysis is another key for humility in leadership, where the leader must be aware of their sins, specifically pride, envy, greed, lust. The ability to self-investigate one's thoughts, emotions, and actions is a completely introspective self-analysis where humility or lack thereof is revealed. Being humble means knowing your own limitations as a manager-leader and the limitations of your organization. Being humble also means that you cannot achieve your goals alone. Everyone is needed. In addition, being humble means revealing those limitations to others, a critical step toward finding compensatory strengths in other people and other organizations. Contentment. Humble people are often contented people, meaning the leader is content with himself as humble, content with his own defects, content with his own unworthiness, and content with his neighbor's success. According to Collins, leaders who are humble channel their ego needs away from themselves and put themselves into a larger goal, that of building relationships. This level of contentment involves being content with one's own ego and letting the real ego go. Keeping perspective. Keeping perspective is the ability to see the bigger picture and to not get bogged down in the mire of today. This also involves maintaining a sense of humor and the ability to laugh at oneself. Now, there are several noted benefits for humility in leadership. First is the potential for humility to influence leaders to produce behaviors that serve others as opposed to self-serving. Secondly, the potential exists for leaders to show public adulation and self-attention. Thirdly, humility in leadership could possibly contribute to organizational performance through its impact on organizational learning and organizational resilience. The attention now turns to the first benefit, the potential for humility to cause one to serve others, specifically servant leadership. Humility and servant leadership are inexplicably linked. The two are hand in hand and inseparable. Servant leaders exhibit humility in the very essence of leading and serving others. The humility aspect of servant leadership allows the leader to be focused on others as opposed to being self-focused or even organizationally focused. In the ultimate sense, servant leadership is self-inflicted accountability in the service to others. The servant leader is fair and humble, which is in agreement with Swindoll, who states a major characteristic of servant leaders is their ability to be vulnerable and humble. Swindoll also explains that servant leaders are those who do not center attention on their own accomplishments, but rather on other people. This is congruent with Fairholm and Fairholm, who state that the servant leader's concentration on service limits the negative effects of self-interest, and humility counteracts that self-interest. Servant leadership is for the unassuming with behavior consistent with humility, whereby a leader is not arrogant, not haughty or egotistical, but rather is humble and unpretentious. Indeed, this humbleness is a necessity for leaders. Humility is evidenced in the servant leader who is a willing listener, feeling accountable to those that they serve, and by openly receiving criticism and advice, in fact, seeing these as welcomed opportunities to better serve others. Crom regards servant leaders as not having any room for arrogance, and this is the humility, seeing things from another's perspective, which produces appreciation and respect within the organization. The servant leader, according to Swindoll, is not interested in their image or in being exalted. The servant leader is more interested in being accountable and serves from an authentic desire to help others and is continually searching for ways to serve others by staying in touch with their people. This humility, says Swindoll, operates from a nothing to lose or prove agenda, just pure service. This, according to Story, allows for consensus building with your followers. Collins offers that humility is a stepping stone for leaders, This is what differentiates the good from the great. And humility for leaders is this ability to grasp the idea of not knowing or understanding or having all the answers. Humility, according to Collins, is demonstrated by a compelling modesty, shunning of public adulation, not being boastful, calm determination, relying on inspired standards, ambition, not self-channeled, a setting up of successors for great success, and looking to the people of the company for appropriation of such success. The humility aspects is the ability for the leader to grasp the fact that he or she does not have all the answers. And for the servant leader, this opens the door to the future by knowing the right questions to ask that will lead to the best possible insights. I have great appreciation for the work of Winston, who advocates that employees are intelligent people with worthwhile advice to give, which is clear evidence of humility among leaders. This is consistent with Collins, who states that the who question must come before the what. In other words, the people are the focus, then the organization, the vision, the strategy. The who first and the what second should be a rigorous discipline. Humility causes a leader to give the greatest gift a leader can give to the followers. This is the gift of self. This gift is given with reverence, respect, humility, and care. Swindoll, who also states that giving of self shows humility of the servant, is not to be equated with poor self-esteem, but rather humility is in line with a healthy self-awareness and knowledge, allowing the leader to totally focus on the followers and the followers' needs. Humility is several things, according to Hayes and Comer. It is humanness, meaning that humility is the connection between the leader and his or her followers in their core. It's also vulnerability, meaning knowing that you as the leader have not arrived and never really will. It is about leader maturity and responsibility. And finally, it's also about perspective, meaning you view yourself as no better or worse than others. Sure, you are aware of your experiences and accomplishments, and yet you're also aware of such without self-exaltation, or in other words, pride. Hayes and Comer also offer what humility is not. It is not weakness. It is not the lack of self-confidence or low self-esteem. It is not absence of ego, and it is not the lack of assertiveness, ambition, or the ability to speak out. Humility fosters within the leader the ability to have good judgment with tact and with timing. A perspective of humility has been presented, and one that offers humility not as a weakness or a permissiveness, but rather as a virtue, a strength, one that would cause a leader to lead with a focus on others. Humility is a necessity in today's leadership arenas. Really, who needs another hero or a larger-than-life persona? What is truly needed is the leader who is humble, the one who is willing to lay down that selfish part of themselves and truly serve their fellow man, their organization, their society, and their world. Interestingly enough, often those are the very heroes that we're looking for and searching for. It seems that most folk might agree that a humble life, humble leadership, and a life of service to others is indeed a life worthwhile. I leave you with this perspective of Strom, who offers the following. There is a paradox in what we are saying about humility. To be humble is to recognize that we are both small and big. Small in the face of a big world offering a large life. Big in the face of petty fears and self-doubt that may rob us of the joy of life. Small as those who have much to learn. Big as those who can learn far more than we can imagine. Small as a child helpless in his mother's arms. Big as a child who brings a father to his knees. If we are indeed fearfully and wonderfully made, then humility is our amen.